Hello, Science Sunday fans. Here we are in the year 2022, and we haven't done this since last year, so we're a little bit rusty, I think.
Yeah, I forgot my laptop. My husband broke his foot just before Christmas, and is kind of suffering the consequences of that with a boot and a cast and all of that. So this morning, right when I was walking out the door, he said, "Oh, can you make me a cup of coffee and carry it up the stairs?" So I did that. I had to fight with the coffee machine, which I've never used before. It was a Christmas gift to him. And then in the process, I forgot my laptop. So I can see everybody's chat here on my phone, and I do remind everyone that if you have a comment or question, you can, if you're viewing the live stream here on YouTube, type in your question or comment, and I'll do my best to relay it to Mike.
Great. Okay. And I didn't print out my list of my slides, so I think I'm flying a little bit blind as to my segues as I channel on to the next thing. I say, what is my next slide coming up? And if I flip back real quick, it's because I shouldn't have been at that next one yet. Anyways, we welcome you here to Science Sunday. Happy 2022. We finally got some snow on the ground, and we're also looking at halfway through January, and spring is on its way.
Yeah, we thought we were going to be hopefully meeting in person, but the best laid plans.
Right. Right. When the church decided it couldn't bring things together for in-service things, we realized we couldn't do it as well too. I did want to say this is a second part of a series on power, like your screen says. And this is kind of I talked originally about the evolutionary aspects, or some evolutionary aspects of power in people and societies. And there may be a few negatives today, a few downers, a few things we can't, the negative parts, negative aspects of power that we'll have to cover today a bit. But I think we'll have a final discussion in 3 more weeks, first week in February, and that may tie up a few of those loose ends. So there may be a few downsides of power that we'll cover and talk about, and maybe a few I'm too depressed to do. But anyways, that's coming up, and we'll slug through this and go on to others as well too later. I also wanted to say that I wanted to do this with some level of a scientific emphasis, and it's interesting because it's one of the softer sciences, and it's tough to do scientific studies about power and authority.
Right.
They had been done back in the 50s and 60s and so on with a little bit more freedom and elan, and people started realizing some levels of potential ethics violations or challenges to people's well-being by studying power situations. So one way they get around that is to try to do things like work only on college undergraduates, where it really doesn't matter what occurs to them. They're already messing themselves up pretty much anyways. So,
yeah.
So they do that. But then you start looking at what are the results that you get in studies that use college undergraduates, and is that something that you could interpolate throughout all of society? Is that going to be the same in a society in a working environment? Is it going to be the same in a society that's not as well funded, or so on too? So some of the studies are a little bit challenging, and I try to get through some of those topics, but you have to keep in mind that this is not really something that you can put together completely. There's a lot of theories we'll be talking about, but it's pretty tough to say that a lot of this is proven exactly. I wanted to first kind of review a little bit of the evolution of power. I had my slides mixed up last week, and I wanted to, or last time, and wanted to just review a little bit of that. And one thing that I was saying last week is that our closest relatives live in a hierarchical system. Chimps and so on, other apes and primates. Power, let's say in chimps, is generally held by the largest and strongest male. It would be unthinkable for a young chimp to overwhelm or overtake or kill or overthrow the older, stronger, more powerful chimp. Although almost every week in our country even, a young toddler fires a gun and kills an elder person. So there's differences too. But since we share so much of our genome with chimps, it might be thought that we're condemned to live in a hierarchical society as well. It would be based on power. And oddly, and you can find evidence that we do live in a hierarchical system, but oddly, for most of hominid existence, I was saying that apparently really wasn't true. First, I talked about Katie Pollard, computational biologist out in California, and she discovered in 2004, so it's been a while, she discovered the human accelerator region, doing this by computational work, studying areas in our genome that's different from chimps. And she found 118 base pairs of DNA that developed in hominids that switch on during brain development, and that seem to inculcate us with an inner predilection to fairness and honesty that isn't in chimps and other primates. So that's optimistic and sounds good. I talked about her a bit, and then secondly, I spent some time talking about Dr. Michael Tomasello from Duke University, and in a set of experiments, you might remember that he found that humans as young as 3, they concern themselves with issues of fairness towards others, and something not shown by other primates in his studies too. So that's kind of an interesting aspect of humans, hominids actually, developed this capacity to have a little bit more empathy and capacity to see others' points of view, which maybe allowed us to get into society, form societies, and advance in the ways that we've advanced rather than the ways that other animals have evolved.
So empathy and being able to imagine what other minds are thinking.
No, you're wrong. No, completely wrong. No.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Don't beat me.
No, you're right. You're
Okay.
right. So scientists have postulated now, and this isn't universal, but the thought is that early human groupings, most likely in bands of 10 or 20, that were related individuals by birth, comprised a very flat society that often de-emphasized power and leadership. They'd often, I talked about the Kung people in Central Africa who insulted the meat when a hunter captured or killed an animal. They would try not to elevate that person up to a higher status. So in these small groups, you didn't try to, the thought is that in those days and for much of existence, that was not an accepted thing. This is from 200 through 250,000 years ago till fairly recently, that these small bands of people lived in a manner in which they did not really have a large hierarchy. Okay. It wasn't needed. Little emphasis was placed on that at all. Somewhere around 10,000 years ago, though, which seems to be a fairly significant moment in human transitions and human growth, some things occurred that we'll talk about. But really from 200,000 years ago or prior to this, all this time, flat non-hierarchical societies, for the most part. They know that maybe in about 3 different ways that I've seen cited. One is that there were no big, massive, spectacular grave sites or burial scenes for people in those days. Everyone was treated pretty much the same.
This was before ancient Egypt then,
Before,
right?
yeah. There's been very few of those found. There's also been very little capacity to determine a difference in terms of health and diet of different people. All seem to subsist and share the same diet. It wasn't like it was with King Henry VIII being fat and corpulent and all his people only a few hundred years ago being skinny and poorly fed. And so those are two of the main ones. Right now I'm blanking out on what the third one was, but really not a lot of evidence of anything except flat communal style living, okay? Which is not how the chimps that lived at that time would have been living.
Well, often archaeology is one of the things I'm interested in, and I know that some of the ancient archaeological sites, they have a large communal dwelling and then maybe other dwellings outside of that, but the communal central meeting place seemed not to be particularly, in many cases, a living quarters. It was just the place to socialize and hang out. So there weren't, large houses and small houses and palaces and whatnot in a lot of the ancient sites.
Right. But something allowed that to change, and that's what we're going to be talking about in the next little bit here, right? About 10,000 years ago, and maybe you have some ideas about what or why that was caused, this seemed to start changing. And if you think from 10,000 years ago to now, that's a blink of an eye in geological and in human biological times, right? We're still living with the brains that our forebears had 10,000, 12,000 years ago. So we're working with the same skills that they had. So groups of hundreds maybe started to get together to form villages. Not much later than that, thousands would gather to form simple chiefdoms, have larger battles, and so on. This is around maybe 7,500 years ago, so 5,500 BC.
About the time of the Egyptians and some of the ancient civilizations.
Yeah, simple chiefdoms would have been a little bit before that. I'm thinking that the next page would be the people that we remember more, the Egyptians and the Greeks and so on.
Okay.
These had been the early Macedonians maybe, and tribes, chiefdoms and kingdoms in Africa, possibly in different places. South America, beginnings of some of them. Then you got to more complex chiefdoms of tens of thousands were around about 7,000 years ago. Archaic states like this. This is Greece, Athens, the Parthenon up on the hill there, the Acropolis. Archaic states comprising hundreds of thousands formed 5,000 years ago. And by 500 BC, mega empires topped out in the millions, even tens of millions were controlled by aspects of civilizations at that time. This is an artist's rendering of taking the actual scenes at Machu Picchu and putting roofs on some of the damaged houses and so on to try to give it more of a style of what it looked like around 500 BC or so.
Eugene, who's watching us online, asks if you're familiar with bonobos. There's a 2005 book by Franz Duvall called Our Inner Ape, and Franz says that in the bonobo society, females are the leaders.
Right, right. Yeah, I don't think they recognized bonobos until somewhere maybe 10 years ago or so, that they were somewhat of a break-off away from chimpanzees, very similar in some ways, but had different cultural and different behaviors, yeah. Very much cooperative behaviors rather than hierarchical and dominant behaviors, right? So maybe they're getting some of the human accelerated regions or the
interesting, yeah, some
bonobo accelerated regions
yeah.
that humans develop too. Yeah, Franz Duvall, I talked about him 3 weeks ago or so, 4 weeks ago when we had our last Science Sunday about power, and some of his studies about power and domination and hierarchy in chimps are classic stuff, and I think I've actually had the pleasure of hearing him speak. He came to Chicago and speak, okay. And I was able to hear him talk. So when you think of, from all that point, from flat to hierarchical, in really, like we're saying, the biological blink of an eye, a system dominated by flat, communal, cooperative existence changing to one of hierarchy and structure. There's a king or a leader being carted around by others in a chair. In really 10,000 years is an astronomical change in many, many ways, change sociologically, psychologically, incredible and well worth studying and looking into why that occurred and what went on with that. Okay? So what does that mean? Why is there hierarchy, and why did hierarchy return? The hierarchy we have now is not the hierarchy of the chimp structure, but it's a hierarchy that's developed in a short amount of time in order to solve problems, I'd say, that humans have faced in this last 10,000 years. And the problems are parts of things that we'll discuss in a little bit. It's an interesting aspect, though, that immense amount of change is something well worth discussing.
I had a
Go ahead.
curiosity about, when Europeans first made contact with native peoples in America, there were many, many tribes and many different cultures. Some of those seem to have been hierarchical with chiefs and war councils and whatnot. But I'm not by any means well read on Native American history. But it seems plausible to me that other groups of Native Americans were had a more flat hierarchy, that maybe there weren't a lot of anthropologists around during first contact to explore that, but maybe there were many different ways of being on these non-technological societies.
Well, I kind of wanted to see, why would we, in 10,000 years, why would we go to this extent? If you have ideas from at home, Eugene and others, send them in to Scott. We'll talk about them. I don't want to just keep presenting about things. I'd like to hear, why are we as hierarchical as we are? And is it an answer to a problem of some nature?
I'm sure you've read about the Agrarian Revolution and how that might have been implicated. I don't know if you plan on bringing that up. And then also religion and identifying ancient religions were often animistic, from what I gather, and then once religious beliefs took on personifications, Zeus and Ahura Mazda and other deities, then special people could talk to those, so that the interplay between religion and social hierarchy became relevant also.
Right. There's a kind of play on words you can think about, maybe two answers. Has anyone said anything about
Not
this?
yet,
No? And one aspect you can think of, you can put the two together and say war and peas.
Peas. War and peas.
War and peas.
Yeah.
Good way to remember it. So if you think of a structure in which you have agricultural aspects of life coming into play, actually, do you realize that when agriculture started becoming the main way of feeding people, our health deteriorated significantly?
Yeah, I've read about that.
There was
amazing.
common loss of almost 6 inches of height in men and women. They were they had a much more constrained diet.
Less
not as
diverse.
rich, less
Yeah,
diverse.
right. Yeah.
A lot of issues became, but it did also do some good too. It allowed people to settle down, to take some land, and to feed and have more common food structures throughout the course of their time. But it was not an easy existence. It was very, very damaging. One thing that obviously agriculture forces a culture to do is to be concerned about land. They need the land that they've had to grow. They've worked and put effort into it. They've sweat labor into the land that they're harvesting crops from, and they have to protect it to some extent. It was different in different places, and that's something. If you think of South America, parts of South America are just large rainforests and large jungles and areas, and if you were beaten off or kicked off a certain area of land by another tribe who liked your property, you could go a few miles down the river to someplace else and clear some more land and start again. So it wasn't that bad, and that's an area in which there are still, to this day, hunter-gatherers who have lived that way. It hasn't been essential for them to protect their land, and part of protecting land, the peace part of protecting it is the war part as well too, right? So, however, over in Peru, very mountainous regions, if you had an area that you'd build some beautiful tabletop farming at and so on,
yeah.
terraces and the farms that you'd grown and so on, that land was extremely valuable. And if someone would come along and try to take it away from you, you would be hard put to replace that in any sense of time before you'd probably starve to death from not having any food.
Yeah.
So in those areas, that's where a more hierarchical structure developed. The hunter-gatherers weren't affected too much by potential loss of land in Brazil and the Amazon, whereas in Peru, there was a great need to protect your land, and to protect your land, it's fairly important to have a larger force of people to help protect and feed, help protect and guard, the land that you're trying to protect. So
flat societies were on flat geographies, and societies with elevated status were in elevated terrain.
It could be a part of it, right? Yeah. At least in this example, I'm not sure if that applies everywhere, but it's not a bad concept.
And it's multifaceted, right? Right. There's so many plausible things that all came together.
So the agricultural part of it is important. The peas part is that you need your land, or you need reasonable land to live on, and agricultural people needed land, which meant they needed a force to protect themselves and their land. With the advent of ranged weapons, which we talked about a while back, that has a big impact too. If you'd have two similar sized, two small clans of people facing off against each other, they're roughly the same size and not a big issue. But if you decided that you really needed to take over someone's land, you would tend to try to get someone that could train and get a group of people that were knowledgeable, get ranged weapons and practicing on your bow and arrow shooting and your spear chucking and your atlatl flinging and all these different things, all very hierarchical skills that take someone who's knowledgeable in that to train the others. And you'd be very interested in having someone who knew how to organize a battle and organize a fight. You'd say that most battles, and I think it was pretty well known in North America, Indians, when they interacted with each other in a hostile way, often basically counted coup. They took, if they could touch a fallen person or touch another opponent with a coup stick, they would treat that as a great reward. Victory, and so on. It wasn't a very, in that sense at least, it wasn't bloody or bloodthirsty or anything like that. It was a matter of honor and protecting your pride and so on. So actually, when you started getting to the point where there were these capacities of armies to train, or groups of people to train, and quickly becoming armies, the strongest army would win, especially with ranged weapons. Imagine that you had, and sizes of your army would be very important. Imagine that you had an army of 500 people.
Okay.
And I have an army of 1,000 people.
Uh-oh.
Okay. If we're going to go and have a slugfest, my people would probably have it, but it would be it would be very costly to me and very costly to you. But imagine if each of us had archers, and you had 500 archers, and you could send your arrows toward me, and I could send with my 1,000 archers arrows toward you. Well, first of all, I'm sending twice as many arrows towards you. Let's say that both of us are equally skilled, and 30% of my arrows either kill or maim or take your people out of action. If my 1,000 guys fire it, that's 300 arrows that have landed, right?
Right.
So your force of 500 has dropped now to 200. You lost 30% of my arrows landed, so you lost 300, more than half of your people. Well, your 500 people shot 500 arrows at me, and 30% of them were effective. 30% of 500 is 150. So I've gone from 1,000 down to 850 people. You're down to 200 people. I have more than a 4 times advantage now after our first sortie of things, right? So ranged weapons and atlatls and bows and arrows and so on made larger armies, larger groups, much more effective and efficient at beating off other peoples. Okay.
And the Earth was changing too. Right. You may be talking about that, but you know, the end of the Ice Age, and you talked previously this year about the Pleistocene and how the world was not just changing because of ice melting, but just the migrations of animals and different plant biomes and whatnot.
Right, yeah. And so how do you make your group succeed?
Right.
And we find that many societies either found or some societies didn't find a way to succeed, and success seems to be measured by how they grew and how the hierarchy they developed.
It occurs to me that at the time of the end of the last ice age, there would have been a lot of both opportunistic and forced migrations of peoples, even people who were previously hunter-gatherers. You know, fish, for example, has been shown in ancient cultures, and oceanside fishing, lakeside fishing, to be really important. Well, if the oceans are rising and lakes are coming and going because of ice melting and whatnot, you both have an opportunity to explore newly uncovered, previously glaciated land, as well as being forced away from what was previously the shoreline. And so people were in motion and perhaps more competitive for territory and resources.
At least in North America, right?
And Europe, yeah.
Yeah, and Europe, that may not have had as much of an impact in South America or Africa or
Australasia,
Asia or different places. But you're right. I think that those are all adjunct kind of things that come on. So the question about we've been discussing for the last little bit, I thought I'd write it down here. Why did humanity around the globe and in less than 10,000 years change from an abundance of primitive, flat societies into the most complex and hierarchical structures in the history of the world? And that's where we get to war and peace. The advantage of ranged weapons we've discussed on the left side there, that's a reenactment, I believe, of Agincourt when
Agincourt, yeah.
and when the English forces with archers were able to defeat a much more heavily, much larger French force.
The English with their longbows.
Right. And on the right in Egypt, along the Nile there, the new importance of land, we've talked about a bit as well too. That small little strip of land along the Nile became very, very important and needed to be protected and taken care of. All right. So I guess what this seems to me to be leading to is the saying that people with the advent of agriculture got to be much more hierarchical, and it seemed like the solution was to find chiefs, find leaders, find war leaders that could lead you on places. And the answer to the problems of competition between other groups and tribes was to start getting hierarchy. Once you found someone who led your group to victory in a battle or two, people like that don't tend to want to just go away. They want to enjoy the fruits of their efforts and maybe be applauded and accoladed by those around them, and maybe they'd like to become leaders in times of peace as well too. So maybe they don't want to go back to their gardens and plow and plant crops and so on. They want to ponder great things and have other people bring food to them and so on too.
Well, in agrarian societies also, the storage of food and the control of water become important. And you can imagine that one or a handful of people became particularly relevant to the control of food storage and distribution and water as well.
Scribes that could keep track of what was done and how it was done and who owed what to whom, money keepers, money changers. Religion became much more important at that time as well too. People to explain why things were happening, and you had the resources of some nature to pay them to take care of those people and let them go.
Yeah. Lindy reminds us that Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond is relevant to these sorts of questions.
Right,
as well. Yeah.
right. Yeah, that's a great book. If you have an opportunity to read it, Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, fantastic book. I thought it tended to get repetitive. I think I read the first third and got the concept and got the point. And after that, I don't think it was as illuminating, but it was more and more examples. So if you get a third of the way through and get tired of it, I can understand that. It's not the worst thing. So to me, that tends to say that we're somewhat stuck with hierarchy. Hierarchy's worked its way in. Hierarchy solved some of these problems for advancement of culture, for growth of civilizations. It seemed like the only way to do it, and it may or may not be true. We haven't tried too many other ways of doing it, but hierarchy has come in and presented itself as a solution for how to live in a larger society, and seems to answer some of those needs, but it brings its own problems as well, too.
Well, I would contrast it with, the mercantile age and kings and princes with what has developed in terms of legislatures and democracy, and even nations that we consider oppressive and regressive, and like Russia and North Korea and China, they all have at least nominative legislatures. So the notion that, there should be a group of people who help decide things, at least is given lip service in nearly every country in the world now.
Right. Yeah, interesting. It brought me up to a couple of topics, but I think I just need to go past them.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. So if we do need bosses and guards and generals, prison guards, senators, religionists, all these people, and if that's what we need because that makes our hierarchy and our hierarchy makes what we have, then why are so many of these people so dreadful? Why do we have so much trouble with the people that end up there? There's concepts of power and hierarchy, and why is it that so many people that get there aren't really good public servants, right? They're seeking power, they're corruptible.
Not very many benevolent kings.
Right. And that's where this book comes in a lot. Corruptible, Who Gets Power and How It Changes Us, by Brian Klaus. A fairly recent book. He's got recent studies, and I've brought a lot of the concepts of what he's writing about into these last few talks. Corruptible, Brian Klaas, Klaas. Also another one I haven't used as much, but I've always liked, is Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers. #1 nation bestseller, Outliers, talks about success and how that's gained. If you want to study, now if we start talking about how do you study hierarchies and how do you study power and how do you study who's in power and why, then you have to maybe have a couple of topics I wanted to bring in first to you. And I have to bring in one scientific term right now, and that's called survivorship bias. But if you look at this picture here, it's a picture that was developed during World War II. These were planes that came back. The U.S. and England were going across the channel and bombing Germany and trying to bring World War II to a close. And this is a plane, or a picture of the planes. They wanted to study what happened when these planes came back from their bombing missions. And they saw, these are little dots that are showing all the places where Germans had been successful in shooting up the planes and how bad they were. And you can see there's bullet holes and torn off parts on the wings and on the fuselage, on the tail there and so on. All these different places. And they got together, a group of learned people, statisticians and economists and different people, to try to study how to win the war. And they said, here's what we're finding out. These are the planes that we've been able to come and look at, and this is the damage to the planes. And what can we do to protect the planes? We're losing so many planes. What can we do to make these planes safer? What can we do to make more of our boys come back? And if you look at this, you'd start looking at what was going on, and you'd say, well, look at all that damage there. And it could lead you to believe something here. And the question is, where the damage is, should we put more metal on? Then metal will slow the planes down, right? It'll cause some problems. It'll hurt steering. It'll make them even more susceptible as they go a little slower and a little bit less nimble. It'll make them more susceptible to more bullets. But where should we put the protection, or what should we do to the planes? And the group looked at this and they realized something pretty critical. If you look at this, you'd say, well, boy, right in the fuselage there behind the pilot, there's a lot of holes there. Let's put some protection there. And the outside of those wings and everything, and let's put some protection there. But there's a problem with that.
The places where there aren't a lot of bullet holes are probably places that are already have a lot of mass, like the engines and the cockpit and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. If you look at this, they got data. The data that they had was the best data they could get, and they got the data by evaluating the Allied bombers that returned all the way from these bombing missions over Germany. But they weren't able to evaluate the ones that didn't return.
Right.
So if you would have said, let's put these things over where these bullet holes are, these are actually places where you can get bullet holes and still fly all the way back from Germany across the channel and land back in England again, and your crew can get off as safe as they could get off. So this is called survivorship bias. If you look at the things that are evident only in the things that have achieved some level of goal, like returning from England or achieving a position as a person in power, a higher up person in power, you aren't evaluating all the features of that, right? So if they'd look at the ones that had the bullet holes right where the pilot is and right at the engines and so on, those weren't in the calculations because they nosedived into Germany, all right? So that's a kind of, as we keep going through this stuff, as we look at things, you have to be careful, because when we start talking about power, then you can start looking at who are you actually evaluating when you look for this power. You're looking for people that have maybe had 3 different things occur. So when you study power, what do you really see? One is, you're seeing, you have to be concerned with what people seek power. So one group of people that get in power are people that tend to seek that power, right? And if you're looking at what people want to be in power, then you're not finding all the people that should be. You're not finding all the aspects about power. Are there people who don't want power but should? You can think about that. There's a story in the book about a police force. And they had in Doraville, Georgia, and they had a recruiting video that they made. And they had like a hip hopper having a song that was pretty misogynistic, die somethings. And these people had a SWAT team come out of a large vehicle, and they went into a Kmart or something like that, and they're all showing their guns and showing everything like that. And if you're looking at a recruiting video and you're deciding, I might like to be a police officer, I think I could do some good at that, and then this is what they present to you, you might not choose to go and be a police officer in Doraville, Georgia. And other people, maybe military people, maybe certain other people would find that pretty appealing, right? So certain people maybe want to seek the power that is there in police work, and certain people that maybe should be police officers aren't really seeking it, right? New Zealand has had a lot of issues with indigenous people and so on. About 12 years ago now, I think they started putting out some videos for their police force. And they had somebody running up a street, and they stopped because they were running up the street and an older person was walking. No, they stopped and helped the person walk across the street. And then they went back running, chasing down some criminal and everything. And then there was a native Maori person that was running too, and they were doing something. They stopped to help someone else as well. They fed a poor boy, I believe, that was looking at a dumpster. And finally they got to the object of their search. These two combined together and found the object of their search, and it was a dog that had stolen a toy or something like that from somebody, right? And so they had women and Maori indigenous people in this whole thing and everything, and they've been very successful with having a police force that's turned over completely, changed to be a much more representative force of who should be maybe helping people in New Zealand, right? Who should be
Helping
police
rather
force.
than being, militaristic about it.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So there's people that seek power, and studies, if you start reading or looking into some things, you should be very careful to see who are they picking for these studies. Are there people that seek power, and are they people that are just picked indiscriminately, right? I know that in that, what's his name? In the Stanford experiment on the Grimaldi, the studies of people being assigned, again, college students being assigned to either be a guard or be a prisoner. And they handed these guys guards. When they actually, not many people know this, when they actually recruited for people, they put an ad in the school newspaper, and they said, wanted college undergraduates to volunteer in a study to study prison life. And then they had the results that we talked about 4 weeks ago, in which the guards were pretty brutal to the prisoners and so on, and there's a lot of different reasons about it. We spent a lot of time with it. But just recently, West Virginia University did a study in which they replicated this study, except all they did was they sent out to different schools, they sent out invitations to be in a study.
Period.
Right, and the invitation was a complete, in half of those students, in half of those schools, was join this study about prison life. And in the other half of the studies they sent out, join this study about psychological issues or whatever. And they found, then they did a test of the people that responded to each of those ads. And the people that responded to the ads about prison life had much more higher rankings on a scale of narcissism and
Dark personality traits.
dark personality traits, right? So you have to be really careful about what people you're asking about to join in your studies, or as you're reading studies, what they actually are saying. Another thing that maybe is hidden when you study about power, the next thing is what people actually achieve power. Are positions of power distributed equally amongst a variety of different people? Do we even keep certain people from getting in power from some reasons? Sometimes maybe they're too dark personality traits, sometimes they aren't enough. What are the people that actually achieve power? So when you're studying, if they do a whole study of 500 CEOs or something like that, and they study power, that's a self-selected group. There's survivorship bias just as much or more so than they were about the planes that made it or didn't make it across the English Channel, right? there's groups in here that when you study, you're not studying average people, you're not studying the norm. And another question is who stays in power? You don't tend to study people who haven't stayed in power very long. You look at the people who've retained power and built on it and done more and more and more. So these are all things that affect studies about power. For example, have you ever heard of Pedro Lescurier?
I don't think so.
Probably not, and I would imagine that no one that's listening has too. He's actually the person who's stayed in power the least of anybody. He was actually in the head of state, the head of the government, president of Mexico for 15 minutes.
15 minutes?
Right.
Impressive.
He was he was put in as part of a military coup that immediately got squashed and was back out on his keister, I guess. So those are things that when you study power, you have to be careful about who's in power and why they're in power, how long they've stayed in power, and so on. Okay? We focus on the trifecta, but that's not really right. There have been studies that have located even genetic markers, and I just want to spend a little bit of time with that. They've actually found genetic markers for leadership skills. There's one allele, if an adenine gets replaced with a cytosine on one thing, there's something like a 25% more chance of people having leadership results in their life and so on. But really, when you look at that, there's something that's much more indicative of leadership than whether you have some genetic change in your genetic structure. Can you identify? I'd say two things right off the bat should be able to determine whether you have a potential as a leader or not.
Birth order?
Birth order may be one, okay. Being white in America is pretty important about power.
Or male.
And being male,
Yeah.
right? All right. So we would like incorruptibles in power. I have a chart about that I want to get to in just a minute. We would like incorruptibles to be in power. We'd like kind coaches, right? People that really help each person along the way. We'd like bosses who empower their staff. Police officers who actually do serve and protect. And politicians who genuinely tried to make life better for their constituents. But in reality, we sometimes, more often, get leaders and others in positions of authority who lie, cheat, swindle, who serve themselves while they cheat and exploit and abuse others.
Or serve a very narrow constituency.
Right, right. So here's the chart. I hope it shows up well on the screen for you. I'll look over here. It's a little bit small on my back wall.
Maybe we can zoom in on this chart while you talk about it.
Right. Okay. So this is the Fortune 500 companies. And as you look at that, you can see it breaks down the leaders of Fortune 500 companies, the 500 CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies in the United States, as of, I believe, around 2020 or so. So it's fairly current. As a percent of the population, men are 50% of the population. But if you look over to the right, they're 94% of the Fortune 500 companies, leaders. And that's 468. That's what those numbers are in parentheses. 468 out of 500 are men. White men and women are 60% of the U.S. population, and they're 92% of the Fortune 500 company presidents. I don't know how that can be.
Yeah, well, the men includes men that aren't white.
Okay,
very
that's
first
right,
one,
right,
yeah.
that's right. White men are 30% of the U.S. population, but they're 86% of Fortune 500 companies. And 431 of them are white men. Obviously, 30 then are white women to get to the 461. 30 white women, 6% of Fortune 500 companies. Working down, 6.5% of the population are black men and 6.5% are black women. And they're 0.8%, less than 1% of Fortune 500 companies are black men, and 0 black women lead Fortune 500 companies. Going down again, Latino men and women, 9% and 9%, and 2 and 0. And Asian men and women, fairly close, at least Asian men, to their portion of the US population. Asian women a little bit less than that. So that's positions of power and people that have them. If you want to think about that, let's think it just in the tech industry. It's not just actual numbers, it's what we even know. Can you name a male leader from the tech sector?
Sure. Jeff Bezos.
Jeff Bezos.
Tim Cook.
Yeah.
On and on.
Mark Zuckerberg. Steve Jobs was there. Mm-hmm. Elon Musk was even in. I mean, these people, we hear their names almost every day, right? And they're involved in things and do things and so on. Now, name a woman in the tech sector.
Carly Fiorina.
That's the only one I could come up with, right?
Yeah.
Carly Fiorina. And the two most named, if you name a woman in the tech sector, you know what the two most named are?
I don't.
Alexa and Siri.
Oh, no.
If people have to name, and they just are put on the spot and have to name a woman in the tech sector, leader in the tech sector, they say Alexa and Siri. So,
Which are robot assistant devices for your home.
Right.
They're not people.
Right. And it's not just business, and it's not just America. As of 2020, just 16 of the 193 members of the United States and the United Nations were led by a woman. 16 out of 193. So this leads to a notion called the Savannah Hypothesis. The Savannah Hypothesis kind of goes back to our brains, our Stone Age brains, that we haven't evolved much. When you think of 98% or something of our life as hominids has been on the savannah, has been living in a non-hierarchical society, maybe the strongest person or whatever might be of help at the times, but evolution has burned into our brains a set of templates for selecting those who would lead us.
Peter online says Sheryl Sandberg.
Okay.
Peter, I don't know who that is. Maybe you can tell us.
Yeah, I don't know either. So these templates are activated whenever we encounter challenges. If you're looking for a challenge right now, if there's a terrible war going on, or if there's a terrible pandemic, a lot of times people look for a strong person to lead. They're saying nowadays it's more of a common thing to find the power that you can answer questions more quickly with a strong man rather than going through a democratic process. So these templates get activated in times of crisis, and in that we tend to look for, to some extent, someone who will come along and help us out and save us. And so in studies now, they do things in which they take pictures, and with CGI, computer graphics, they can moderate people's height and moderate people's facial features. They can take the same picture and make it look taller or shorter, make the person look taller. They can also make it look more masculine or more feminine. They can feminize a picture, CGI. And they put these pictures out to random groups of people, and they have a predilection for picking the more masculine, the taller figure, and so on. And that's only bested at times of crisis, when they put people in crisis and say, imagine that your boat is, has gone ashore at sea, or different things like that. Then it's even more obvious that the more masculine, taller figure is going to come along and save us. So that's something that's kind of cooked in our books.
Well, and it occurs to me, we never see, or rarely, unless it's a parody, do we see even in popular culture, shows about, superheroes or champions that aren't strong, masculine men or powerful women. You don't see people with normal body types or a little pudgy or short typically represented as heroic figures, even in our myths.
Right. Or they're often somewhat of a humorous point, right? Someone to make, like they could be imposters. They think they could take over and do this, but they really can't, obviously.
Peter said that Sheryl Sandberg is the chair of Meta. I believe Meta is...
Oh, Facebook.
Facebook.
Yeah. So that's some of the downer things, the populations, the demographics of leadership and so on, that we tend to fight this age-old issue in which we give leadership skills. We give our leadership isn't just taken, it's given, right? We decide to give over the question of who we're going to follow. Power can be defined as the capacity to make others do what you want them to do.
Right.
And we give that power to people by agreeing to do it, right? So some of this is a little bit, when we see that we're locked in this thing as a society of going for powerful people based on masculinity and not other skills that may be much more helpful.
Physical fitness.
Right. But I think that's the point of next time's talk, is to try to look at that and to say, what can we do? Once you know that, once we've studied this and seen it and accept that that's true, this Savannah hypothesis is actual, then maybe we can coordinate and work together to try to adjust and try to save or try to change how we give out our power, our willingness to cede power to other people.
Little in my own mind, I've come up with some prospective ideas about that. It'll be fun to talk about next time. I look forward to that.
Yeah. So, I don't know if there's any questions. Type them in. We'd love to go over them. I've got a bit of time here at the end. There's so much more about it. I've skipped over really fascinating stuff and
I heard.
Haven't gone with others, but go ahead.
We had a guest speaker, Lee McIntyre, for our humanist group last week, and I believe he brought up something I had never heard about before, a different kind of study where they randomly distributed pins, pins to put on your lapel or on your shirt or blouse. They randomly distributed pins, different colored pins, and they found that people, when they socialized, maybe it was a conference or some other just social event, but when people socialized with each other, they tended to accumulate people who had the same color pin. And not only that, they then subsequently ran, if I'm remembering correctly, ran some social or psychological experiments and found that people who were in charge of, punishing someone for a minor infraction, maybe not throwing away a piece of trash correctly or whoever, right? You just come up with some minor infraction. The people who were in charge of punishing others for some minor infraction were more lenient on people who had a randomly assigned pin color that matched their own pin color.
Yeah.
Completely random.
Yeah.
And that talked to me a lot about just how susceptible we all are to biased thinking and imposing our power over perceived outgroups.
There have been a whole bunch of studies on all that, which again, I hasten to say you have to be careful about who they're picking and
How they pick them.
and if it applies with everyone else. Sometimes undergraduates do a lot for a $5 gift card.
Right.
So anyways, there was a study in which they had, this was in England, and they had originally determined who was a favorite football, and the only people in the study were, let's say, Manchester United football fans. So they were all in the study, and supposedly they were supposed to leave this one area where they took the test and move to another area. And on the way over, they individually met somebody who was injured. It was a plant. It was somebody that was set there and was injured and needed help.
The Good Samaritan.
Right. And so they had to give help, and at times they wore a Manchester United jersey, so they were in the same group as the persons that were in this study. Then they had the competitive group, someone who was a foe, a rival of Manchester United. And then they had just neutral jerseys as well, too. And they found exactly what you'd expect. Everyone would stop and help the Manchester United fan and so on.
Yeah.
They further went on to then have a study in which they then gave people credentials, and they had to pick someone who was going to be the leader of their group. And they had a group that was Manchester United, a potential leader to choose that was a Manchester United supporter, but had very poor credentials. And they had leaders or potential leaders from other groups or neutral groups who had much more beneficial, let's say, or much more striking, much more positive.
Relevant.
Yeah, much more relevant credentials. And they'd pick the one from their group.
Yeah.
So there's a
Have
lot
you-
of that stuff that goes on.
Have you heard about the study where college students weren't the subject of the study, but they went out and stood on street corners and assessed whether different drivers were more apt to yield to pedestrians or
In
yield to
crosswalks.
other cars
Yeah.
and whatnot? And they found that people who drove what seemed to be less expensive vehicles were more conscientious and more kind.
Yeah.
Now, you don't know which way the correlation arrow goes or the causal arrow goes. Maybe the people in the nicer cars, because of their life experiences or whatnot, had a predisposition towards being more task-oriented or not aware of others. Who knows?
I was aware of that, and it was reported on NPR, actually.
Okay.
And then someone wrote into NPR, and it was basically the value of the car. More
Right.
valuable cars, people drove with less concern for others. But then this guy was very disturbed about that. He said, you have to take the purpose of the car. For example, Prius hybrids, people like that, they're concerned with the environment. I'm sure that they have a fairly expensive car, yet it is not going to be one of those. He obviously knew that it was not going to be one of those that was going to be
Yeah, they would be
inconsiderate of
kind
others.
people.
They would, yeah, they'd be kind people. And the guy went back and looked through and reran the experiment for that, and he found out, according to him, that they were the worst.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I'm saying this to a bunch of Prius owners out
Yeah.
there, and I own a Prius as well, too, but pretty interesting stuff. You have to keep an open mind and be willing to listen and hear new
Be
things.
deliberately kind and not try to exert power over people unreasonably. We did get a comment earlier on from Randy, who
Yeah.
Skencat. Is that how you say his name?
Yeah,
SCH, Skencat, who said that book he recommends is Braiding Sweetgrass, which seems to have something to do with the behavior of hierarchies and native peoples, etc.
Yeah, native people. I was going to finish on an anecdote of a man who became, and you have to be careful when you look at power. This was a homeowners association in Arizona, and it was one of those things where you have to get somebody to run it and do the things that nobody really wants to do. Everybody wants to live their life, but nobody really wanted to run the homeowners association. People would be on the board, and one of them would be forced to become a president for a while and get off as soon as they could, and so on. But no one really was that interested, and they found this guy who said, yeah, I'll do it. I'd be happy to do that. And started writing up tickets for people that put their garbage out 5 minutes too early, and started comparing the length of the palm tree fronds, and there were a couple of ones that should be taken off because they're dying. He got to be completely obsessed with the power of this all. You could only put certain rocks in your garden. You could only do these things.
You had to have a permit for everything, you know,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And he made life incredibly terrible for a lot of people. They were very, very upset. And other people on the board were dropping off because they hated what he did so much, and so then he put more people on the board that were his picks and so on. And there's a whole story of all the different things that went on and how this was done in ways that really, really were deleterious, were terrible for the people who lived there. They're just trying to live their lives. He was a tyrant, right? The petty tyrants that get in there in any position of power. And so I think the story of that is to try to find ways to make an environment in which people that have concern for other people get positions of power, and not just those that are willing to take it on because they see an opportunity and no one else is willing to step in and do it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Hopefully more next week about ideas about getting the right people in the right positions.
Yeah, not next week.
Or in next month.
Next month. So 2 weeks from now, you're talking about infinite...
The infinite speed of light.
Infinite
Those
speed
of you
of
in the
light.
audience viewing us may take issue with that. I want to talk about the theory of relativity over a couple of lectures. And I'm going to start off with the infinite speed of light. Wow. And see what the heck do I mean by that.
Right. Then that's January 30th, 2 weeks from today, and then we're going to get back onto our regular schedule of first and third Sundays, and so the next week after that will be somewhere around the 6th, I believe, of February. I'll be doing my third topic about power and maybe what we can do about it, how we can stop the petty tyrants, how we can encourage other people to step into positions of responsibility and authority.
All right.
All right.
See you all soon.
Thanks so much.
Give us a thumbs up, subscribe, leave comments even after the fact if something occurs to you, and we can reply to them later on.
Right, or adjust what we talk about next time.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks so much.